Hello world, Lisa Friedrichsen, your friend and computer science professor with another short screencast in our textbook series. We're working off this textbook, Basics of Web Design, and its previous version, and we're all the way up to chapter 11. Now, I don't think you're going to have any trouble with the Pacific Trails Resort project if you're doing that, because it's a very short project where you add a subtle transition. You can subtly see those text colors changing from that dark blue to sort of a dark burgundy as I hover over them. Plus, you'll add this little video to the home page. I just want to talk about the chapter in general. Now, digital media, starting with images through video, is a big and wide topic, and I'd highly recommend that you take some digital media classes if you want to become a web developer and work on the front end, work on the design of the web page. Mostly, we've been talking about good HTML and CSS code, but I'd highly recommend that you take some digital media classes if you want to get into image preparation for the web, or when to use images, when to use videos, when to use text, and when to use audio for your message. And you'll get to practice with audio and video in this chapter. The chapter also introduces the iframe element, which is often looked down upon because if you put a web page in a web page, an iframe in a web page, it's difficult to link to that iframe from a URL. So they're hard to index and build hyperlinks to iframes. So it gives me a chance just to go back to the basics, to always emphasize that we want to use the appropriate language for the appropriate task whenever possible. We want to use HTML to mark up and describe content. We want to use CSS to style and position or layout content. And we want to use vanilla JavaScript, which just means JavaScript without extraneous heavy libraries such as jQuery, for interactivity. And W3 Schools is a great resource for all these three technologies as well as other web technologies. However, there is some overlap between the technologies. For example, HTML has the hyperlink element, the anchor element. And if I click that W3 Schools link, that's interactivity with the page. HTML does have a bit of interactivity. In this chapter, I'll show you about CSS transitions, which I'm demonstrating when I roll my mouse over these H2 headings. See how the background is changing ever so slightly and the text color is changing ever so slightly. So that's created by a CSS transition, which you'll learn in this chapter. Again, a bit of interactivity. Mostly interactivity is JavaScript. If I click this image, then I'm swapping the image for another image. That's a typical use for JavaScript. Clicking on something on the page, such as an image or a button, and having different content or different text appear. I also thought it was interesting that here she shows you how to do CSS drop-down menus, but there's a big glitch with one of the exercises that I thought was interesting. The horizontal menu works well. When we hover over cuisine, we can choose breakfast, lunch, or dinner. Look what happens when we have the vertical menu at full screen size. When we hover over cuisine, we cannot get over to the breakfast, lunch, or dinner options because they go away. I thought it'd be fun to debug that. And so let's go with the one that works first. I want to remind you that when you're in your web page and your CSS doesn't work quite right, open up your inspector and use your borders to figure out what is going wrong. If I go to the cuisine list item and I go over here and select it in my developer window, I can go ahead and add a border. 1 pixel red solid is my favorite just because it's so obvious. So now when I hover over cuisine, the unordered list that is added has a display of none by default. When I hover over that LI, I can see the drop-down menu, and that's because in the style sheet, the author has put a hover pseudoclass on this element so that when I hover over it, the display of this UL becomes block. So when I hover over an LI that's in the nav, a UL inside that LI becomes display block versus what it is naturally in the CSS, which is display none. We change this display from none to block, and that's how that little drop-down menu appears. But look at what happens over here when I have the vertical menu. When I hover over cuisine, I can't get over to breakfast, lunch, or dinner. And again, I'm going to add a little border on my LIs inside that UL, inside that nav. I'm going to do a red 1 pixel solid border again, and I can see what the problem is. See how there's a little gap between cuisine and breakfast? So when I move my mouse, I'm no longer hovering over the LI. In this little spot in the middle, I'm hovering over only the nav. So I can even prove that to you by adding, let's just add some padding here. Make those bigger. Now when I hover over cuisine, see, I can get my drop-down menu. I'm just trying to prove how you can use that navigation window and that nice border to help debug CSS problems. The book also talks about APIs, application programming interfaces, and remember that HTML automatically talks to CSS through the selector, whether that selector is an element or an ID or a class with a period. And JavaScript also automatically talks to HTML and CSS. So the APIs between these three languages are baked into the languages, are built right into the languages. But you'll learn about some more APIs in this chapter as well. And it's just good to know that an API is simply the technology that allows one technology to speak to another. Enjoy chapter 11. Thank you.